Thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm Marlene Van Ness. I'm with Trellis Legal, and later you'll also hear from another attorney here at Trellis, George Jugovic. And we're a small law practice out of Pittsburgh, and we specialize in food and ag-based businesses. My background's in agriculture. And so we're hoping to give you kind of a brief overview today of some of the considerations with accessing farmland. Obviously, this could be a multi-day discussion, but we're going to kind of hit some of the highlights. And then we do offer free initial consultations through our practice. So if there's additional questions or information you would like, feel free to reach out to us, or PASA has a lot of resources as well as Farm Commons regarding accessing farmland. So we always refer to our partners as well. So just to get us started, kind of the things we're going to be talking about today is farm leasing, which is getting to be, for better or worse, a more common way of accessing farmland, purchasing farmland, and then George is going to talk a bit about the role of easements in oil and gas leases. So what types of easements are possible for your farm, or also if you are purchasing a farm that has easements on it or leasing a farm that has easements, what that means, and then the impact of oil and gas. So we'll start with leasing. So some of these we're not going to have time to get super into today, but some types of leasing that we see in agriculture are a farm incubator, which I'll talk about later, leasing from a land trust, which I think Dan talked about, that's where the next discussion on this topic is going to be, on a farm that's leased from the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. So that'll probably be a good one to attend if you're interested in that option. Short-term leasing, long-term leasing, ground lease, which I'll talk about as well, and then lease to own, which is a system in which you are leasing the land with the ultimate goal of owning it. So what is a lease? Very briefly, it's a legal right to use someone else's land. So typically leases versus something called a license, a lease is exclusive. So that's basically saying, you know, you have a landowner who either is letting you rent their entire property, or back 20 acres of their property, or back 1 acre of their property, in which you have the exclusive right and possession of that land, and with that comes certain legal rights. Leases technically in Pennsylvania can be verbal or written, but as I'm sure you can guess, that verbal leases are a bit risky and can be more difficult to enforce and don't have a lot of the same protections. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when you're looking to lease land, especially in agriculture, because there's so many unique considerations, it's important to think about the relationship. So there's pros and cons to some of these considerations, but if you met a landowner at a PASA event, or another situation, or introduced to someone who you maybe don't have as long of a relationship with. So again, this is talking about a new relationship. I know in agriculture there's also a lot of situations where an employee might start renting from an employer. That's not what we're talking about right on this slide, but if you have a new relationship with a landowner you don't really know, it might be worth to start with a shorter lease and then create opportunities for a longer lease, so you still have some opportunities for land security. And because you're going to be balancing a lot of landowner apprehension with protections for yourself. So they're going to be nervous about leasing long-term to somebody new, and you also want that land security. And then you also might want to know, both sides want to know who they're dealing with. If you're going to have a landowner that's micromanaging everything you're doing, or a lease is only as good as the relationship, in the sense that you can put a lot of things in writing, but unless you want to be going to court to enforce that, a lot of it really comes down to your personal relationship with the landowner. So that's why it's kind of important when you're managing a new relationship to really think about what that means in terms of the lease. And again, that goes to that aspect of, is the landowner going to be involved in it? Are they someone who lives somewhere else and this is property they own in this state and they don't really care, they're just happy to be getting some income from it? Or do they live on another portion of the property and are going to be coming over every day and seeing what's going on and telling you how to do things? So it's important to think about that, and also incorporate, once you get a sense of the relationship, incorporate considerations related to it into the actual lease. So whether or not you're dealing with a new relationship or a long-term relationship, and I've definitely dealt with some farmers who, they've known the person for 15 years and they're seeing this as a way to begin the transition. It's still important to have written lease. And I've had those farmers be like, why does this need to be so specific? I know this person, I trust this person. And that's great. That's a great situation to be going into a leasing relationship. But at the same time, writing is important because not only does it provide you legal protections, but it makes sure you're on the same page. I always say contracts aren't coming from a point of distrust. In fact, it helps foster trust in a relationship because it's saying, hey, we agree on these things and we've had a chance to talk them through. So the very basics are who, where, and when. You know, who's leasing the property, who's the landowner, where on the property. And this can get tricky, especially if you're not renting a whole piece of land owned by a landowner, but rather a portion. What are the edges of that? Just like it's important to have that when you're buying land, it's important to have that when you're leasing land. So you know where your obligations begin and end, and how long is the lease? So when does it start? When does it end? When are you submitting payment? Sometimes farmers will do yearly leases and yearly payment versus monthly payment because it can be more beneficial in regards to growing seasons. But it's important to talk those through with the landlord because going into situations, a lot of people have presumptions on both sides and assumptions about how things are going to move forward. And we all know the old adage about assumptions. So it's kind of important to talk those through. And then it's also important to talk about limitations on premises use. So this can mean a lot of things, but in ag especially it can. So it's talking about, are you allowed to build anything on the property? Are you allowed to put up fencing? And then when you get more into ag specific things, is there certain practices? If you're leasing land on an organic farm, they're probably going to want you to comply with organic practices so they maintain that status. Or they might be a landowner who's passionate about that and wants you to get organic status. Or you have to use certain sustainable practices. Or you're only allowed to have certain type of animals or no animals if they're a farm that doesn't want a landowner who doesn't want animals on the property. So that's really important, as well as zoning. So if you talk to a lot of times we talk about this in terms of property ownership, but it's important for leasing too, to understand if there's zoning limitations on what you can do on the property. Now, a lot of traditional ag activities are pretty protected from a micro zoning kind of, but some newer activities. So if you're leasing land and you want to have and there's a barn on the property that you're leasing and you want to have weddings, just having those discussions about, is there any limitations that you need to be thinking about, both from a landlord tenant relationship and also from a larger regulatory relationship. And that also kind of ties into production. So talking about what you're going to be doing, and that can change, but then you want to allow and say the parties can reevaluate this, or right now I'm going to be growing vegetables, but you want to put in the lease that your plan is to have pigs in the future. So it's important to think about what you want to use the property for and see if you and the landowner are on the same page. You don't want to have a situation where you're planning on expanding into both vegetable and animal agriculture, and God bless you for taking all that on, but that you're also, and then the landlord says, well, I never cleared you having animals. And then you have to try to find land or you have to change your business plan. So that can be really important. And then we talked a bit about the permitted activities. So what are they allowing you to do? What is zoning allow you to do? How is enforcement, things like that. How are the neighbors? If your landlord's like, well, we have these neighbors who hate when we do anything over here, you might want to consider that if you're going to be also on that land. And then facilities. So who's responsible for these things? And that's a huge thing in ag leasing because, as you all know, farming takes is very input heavy and very capital heavy. So if you're leasing, the benefit is that, okay, you're not having to deal with the large upfront capital purchase of the land, but you're still having to deal with the capital needs of the inputs for your specific operation. So the landlord might be providing some of those. So it might be good to hear about. And, if they're saying, well, you can use our electricity, or we have, we're farming on the other part of the land. So we have some storage you can use, and we have trash pickup, we were going to put fencing over there anyway. So it's important to talk about, what are the different facilities that you need for your operation? who's providing those and who's responsible for their maintenance. A lot of times landlords will be happy to let you use tools and equipment sometimes, but if something goes wrong, they'll put it on you to maintain them. And so it's important you kind of account for those kind of things within the lease. Same thing with structures on the property. As well as improvements. So are you allowed to put up fencing and hoop houses and improve soil quality? And if so, is it really fair that you're taking on all that obligation? You know, if it's a lease to own situation, that might make sense. But if there's going to be improvements that you're making that are permanent to the land, you're not going to go, you know, uproot acres of fencing. So is that something that maybe you and the landlord should cost share, or the landlord's willing to invest in because they see a future for that portion of the property? That's always an important consideration, because improvements can cost a lot of money and be beneficial to your operation, but in the end, it's still a lease and you might not get to leave with those improvements that you've invested a lot of time and money in. And that's also important when you're thinking of the term of the lease. You know, if you have a 2-year lease, and it's a hard stop at 2 years, you probably don't want to be doing a lot of improvements on the property. But if you have a 2-year lease to start, and then maybe it has the option to extend it for 10 years or 20 years, or if it's a situation where you know the person really well and you've signed a, you know, 25-year lease, then you can kind of account for that. But that's why it's important to also have all those discussions, because you want to make sure you and the landlord are on the same page before either of you are really investing in these things. And then what are the things that can result, what happens at expiration? What happens at cancellation? Let's say, for example, you weren't able to pay your rent, but you have a bunch of crops in the field and the landlord terminates the lease subject to the provisions in the lease. What's your right to come back and get those crops? Now, there are certain protections under Pennsylvania tenant laws for that, but you want to account for what happens at the expiration of this. What are you allowed to take? Are you allowed to take equipment or certain structures that you build if it's movable? What does that look like? And especially in agriculture, that's a really unique consideration as to what happens. It's not like an apartment where you just pack up your movable stuff and, you know, move to another one. Farming, as you all know, it involves a lot of those types, more permanent type structures, as well as, you know, crops in the ground that need to finish out growing seasons. And then renewal. So if you are starting with a short-term lease, in what situations can you renew it? I know a lot of times when I'm helping farmers negotiate these things, if it's a newer landlord situation, we might say, okay, this is going to be a 2 or 5 year lease, but then I want the option, you know, that as long as I'm not in default, I can renew this for another 10 years, because you want to know if you're going to be able to stay on that land or not, because it goes to a lot of those other considerations. And then dispute resolution. What happens if you can't agree? Do you have to go to court? Do you have a dispute resolution procedure that involves mediation, or a certain number of meetings where you have to try to work things out? You know, discussing that is really important. And it's much easier to have those conversations when the relationship is new or good, versus when things are already starting to get heated. And then termination. What are the landlord's rights to terminate the lease? Do you have any rights to terminate the lease? A lot of times tenants don't have, you know, leases are for a reason, are designed so that you finish them out unless either party kind of breaches or breaks the lease terms, because both sides want some security in that sense. But you do want to talk about, is there any situations in which either party can terminate the lease? And especially in long-term leases, that's really important to think about, because if you get 1 or 2 years into a lease, or even less than that, and realize that the soil in that area is pretty much unworkable, and we'll talk about why due diligence is important later, but having those kinds of considerations and knowing what can happen, it's important to think about under what conditions can you terminate. And so kind of in addition to those main lease considerations, so we talked about disputes a little bit, so you want to put them in the lease, what court has jurisdiction, things like that. But then additionally, if you're going to be living on the property, it might make sense to separate the residential lease from the land lease, because in Pennsylvania especially, there's, and in most states, there are more protections for residential leases. You know, you have a warranty of habitability in the sense that the place that you're living, you have to have basic amenities, heat, water, things like that. And if it's unlivable, you have certain rights under the law, which for a commercial lease, which is what just a farm or land lease would be, doesn't have those kind of protections. And so if you lump them all together into one lease, it can get kind of tricky as to where the protections start and end. And then also considering that if you end up stop farming and terminate the farm lease, is it possible for you to still live on the property longer while you kind of figure out your next steps? So it's important to think about whether or not you want to separate those leases or put them all together. Unique circumstances and payment options. Sometimes I've seen farmers work out deals where they pay the landlord in a portion of their crop, which is a good option. It's important to think about what that means from a financial reporting situation, which we're not going to get into, but think about that. If you want to have any, like I talked about before too, as paying on a yearly basis rather than a monthly basis, and things like that, or kind of this mixed payment and crop share, what that looks like, that's definitely important to put out in writing and make sure everyone's on the same page for it. And then one thing just to be aware of in Pennsylvania, so there's something called the rule of perpetuities, which basically said that if you have an open-ended lease, that they're not enforceable. But in Pennsylvania, they are. We don't have a rule against perpetuities, against contracts that don't have a clear end date. But in Pennsylvania, if you have leases 30 years or longer, the state basically and a lot of counties imply that it's subject to what's called a transfer tax, which is the same as when you transfer real estate. If anyone's ever bought real estate, you have to pay a transfer tax. And the state can imply it because basically they're saying, look, you basically had this property as long as someone would have, if they bought it, we should be getting our cut of this, because of course they're going to think that. So it's important to think about, and there's ways you can craft leases that get around that. And, there's questions about how often they're enforcing this, but it is important to be aware of that and potentially talk to an attorney if you're looking at a lease that has that kind of length. So just as an example, if you have a lease, and this is very common in the ag community, and I get it, a lot of people do things on a handshake and a sense of trust. But unfortunately, that trust doesn't always pass down between generations. So let's say you have a verbal lease with a landowner, you've lived, your families knew each other, and he knew you were looking for farmland. And so they let you use that land. They said, we have these back 5 acres we're not using. You can go ahead and farm that. And you've been paying your rent on a yearly basis, but then all of a sudden they pass away. It's an older couple and they pass away, and their children say, you know what, we don't have any interest in farming or, being landlords. We just want to sell the property and take the money and divide it up. If you have a verbal lease, you only get 30 days notice in Pennsylvania for the notice of termination for a lease that's year to year. So, and if you didn't pay your rent for some reason, then it would be 10 days. But what's important to know here is that, you could basically have been farming for a couple of years on this property and investing in it, because even, in a lot of cases, the landowner will say, oh yeah, you can just keep using that. Maybe we'll sell you the farm one day. But you need to make sure you have some things in writing, because if you have it in writing, unless there's a specific clause in there that would say otherwise, the lease would generally remain valid and you would have a right to remain on that property till the end of the lease term. So that's why it can be really important to get things in writing, in addition to all the other reasons I've talked about. So just real quick, I'm going to get into specialty leasing options. I believe that CASA has a really good chart that they've put out talking about some of these. So that's important to look at as well. But a ground lease is essentially a system in which you are leasing the land, but you have a certain amount of equity or ownership in buildings on the property. So it's kind of a way, because a lot of farmers struggle with not having, if you're leasing, you don't have a lot of collateral to put up, and you're not gaining any equity in any of the property. So ground lease is in a way that would kind of allow that. And like I mentioned before, it can help with loans and collateral. But one thing to be aware of is that, because these are gaining some more popularity within the land access movement, but that there could be clauses in that lease that basically say, well, but if we, can terminate the land lease, or you breach the land lease, then like give up all your rights in the equity in the building. So it's a cool way to start building up that equity and give you some more options, but it's really important to have an attorney read that or really understand what's all involved in that and in what situations can that equity be revoked. Leasing from a land trust, which I'm sure you'll get to talk about a lot more when you go on that farm access potluck, but a lot of times land trusts will have longer term security. They'll be willing to lease for a longer amount of time. They're less likely to revoke the lease because they, have an interest more in protecting that land, and they want to see it put to use. They're not looking to potentially subdivide it and develop it or anything like that. And a lot of times there are easements on this land that limits their use, which can be a pro or con depending on what your planned activities on the property are. And sometimes even these can be ground leases. I haven't seen a lot of those in Pennsylvania, but that's an option. And they're usually more open to specialty terms. So if you're talking through, if you kind of have some interesting plans or growth plans, they're not coming at it solely from a profit-driven standpoint. So they're probably more interested in working with you to figure out ways to get you on that land and be productive. Like I said, I'm sure you'll have some more insights on that if you go to the potluck. A farm incubator, so what this is more where you have an existing working farm and you can either, share in some of that. So you're given a portion of the land and you grow crops, and so do some other farmers on there, and you kind of share the work and tools and equipment, or you're specifically leasing a portion of that property that exclusively. And it usually comes, usually we use the term farm incubator when it comes with some sort of business joint marketing or other support. So either you're kind of all marketing under one, LLC, or you're part of a program that, this farm is also providing you with some business training and different tools and skills. Farm incubators are typically not long-term. They're usually designed to help farmers learn the necessary skills and build up their brand, but not typically a long-term solution, but they can be, but it's just an option. And then options to purchase, which I'll kind of talk about in the next section, which is basically that kind of lease to own structure. Okay, so that was leasing. And we'll take all the questions at the end. So if you have questions on leasing, just write them down and we'll get to them. So now I'm going to talk about purchasing. So this is where you're in a situation where you can actually purchase the land or get a mortgage or financing and gain total ownership of the land. So what are some considerations for that? Due diligence, which I actually, instead of putting it twice, I'm just doing it once, but it's something that I actually really recommend doing when you're leasing land, especially long-term. And I'll get into why in a minute. Options and first right of refusal, that's kind of part of the lease to own structure. Gifts, getting gifted land, financing, and then the impact of encumbrances, which George is going to talk about more. So due diligence, that basically means that when you're looking at a piece of land, whether for leasing or purchasing, you should know what the land is. You should know about it and know it as inside and out as you can. It's the same as when you buy a house. You basically want to have, that home inspection report. But with farming, you're thinking about other things like, is this soil of good enough quality? Is it too compacted? Is it a soil type that is conducive to the type of farming that I want to do? Does it change soil types or soil densities or different levels of compaction in different parts of the farm that could have an impact on my plan? What is is there any irrigation system set up? What does the drainage look like in the soil? And those are all really important considerations before you sign a long-term lease or buy property. You want to make sure it works for you. And that kind of goes to the planning component. What do you want to do on that property? And that also, ticks the box of, looking at the zoning, looking at any other use restrictions, looking at the neighbors. I know people think that sounds crazy sometimes, but if you have really frustrating neighbors, whether or not your activities are permitted or not, they can make your life a living hell. And so you want to make sure you kind of know, you can even ask the person you're buying it from, like, oh, do you know the neighbors? Like, are they, have you been farming and are they okay with it? Because like I said, even if the activities are permitted, it could still be a major headache when you're trying to get a farm up and running. And that's one less thing you need. So just kind of knowing if the farm fits what you want to do with the property, if it's in the right zone, what the neighbors are like, what the slope is like, important considerations that go into what is, looking at your business plan for your farm and looking at this property and see how they line up. Security, so that's actually more talking about like, what is the long-term use of this property? What is it looking like? But it also talks about safety in terms of, is there risk of damage to fencing? Is there already fencing? Is there things, how much are you going to have to invest in the property to protect your farm and crops, and keep everybody where they're supposed to be, but also talking about the long-term security of that land. Is it in an area that could be heavily impacted by climate change? Is it an area that could be heavily impacted by flooding? Is it an area that that is looking to be rezoned? Thinking about those types of things, both from a safety and a long-term planning aspect. And then George is going to talk a little bit more about gas leases, but one thing to be aware, in Pennsylvania, you can have a separation of your mineral rights from the surface rights, which means that there can be one person who owns the surface property of a farm and one person who owns the mineral rights. And, or if the mineral rights are subject to a lease. So it's important to know whether or not you're going to be owning both the surface and subsurface rights, or just the surface rights, in which sense that could still have some impacts to your surface rights if someone owns the mineral rights and leases it to a gas company, which, like I said, George will talk about more. So it's important to understand, are you going to be owning both aspects, both levels of the property or not? And that's a thing kind of unique to Pennsylvania. Typically, the person who owns the property owns all of the property, the sky above and the land below, but that's not the case in Pennsylvania. And then, are there other encumbrances? And George will talk more about easements, but things where other people have rights of way or covenants on the property. Is there a deed that says you can't do certain things on that property? Now, in rural areas, that's less likely, except for the gas lease and easement sides of things. But especially, there might be something where the neighbor has the right to access certain parts of the property, or there's an easement on it, or there's a covenant where you've agreed never to have farm events on the farm, so things like that. It's important to know what's in those documents and doing that due diligence. This is probably one of the most important parts of both leasing and owning land. So just talking from a first right of refusal and option standpoint, so this is that lease to own, what the differences are. So a first right of refusal essentially means that if the landowner ever was looking to sell the land, so let's say you have a lease on the land for 15 years, but you have a first right of refusal. And 5 years into that lease, the landowner says, look, I'm getting really old. I can't maintain, this property. And I just don't want to deal with being a landowner anymore. I've decided I'm going to sell. Under first right of refusal, which would be a document either within, it'd be a section either within the lease, or sometimes we do it as an amendment or a separate document signed at the same time as the lease. It basically says that they have to come to you first and offer you the opportunity to buy the property. And sometimes we even put in there like it's at fair market value or at or below fair market value, or you might agree on a term, an amount ahead of time. You don't see that quite as much with first right of refusals versus options, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's important to understand, the difference between those two. And then if that's something you at least want to know if the land's going to be sold and have the option to buy it before they offer it to anybody else. So it's kind of an exclusive listing kind of situation. And then an option is basically a guaranteed legal option to buy. That's, again, a separate document or a part of the lease that you would sign when you're leasing the land, but basically says, you go to the landowner and be like, look, I really want to buy this property. The landowner's like, great, I really am looking to get out of this situation and being a landowner and move to, California in the next 5 years, but you say, I can't really afford to buy it right now. So you can structure options in a lot of different ways. So you can structure them so that part of the rental payments are going towards the purchase price, or you can basically say, anytime within the 15 years that I'm leasing this property, I have the option to buy this property at fair market value, or this is where you're more likely to see a set price, where you might say, okay, we had it assessed, and anytime in the next 5 years, the assessed value was, $750,000, so you can buy it at $750,000, and in the next, for every 5 years, it goes up 5%, or the equivalent fair market value. Or they might be saying, look, you can buy it anytime in the next 500,000 because I really want you to have this. So that's what you can kind of do when you really want to purchase land, but you can't quite do it now, but want some security in the fact that, you're not going to have to release this land and then go buy a different portion of the property. Options can also be recorded. The county recorder of deeds, and that can sometimes be a good idea, especially if you're dealing with an older landlord, where you might get that situation again where they pass away and the kids are like, well, he wasn't of sound mind when he signed that, or I've never seen that, or you can't find your copy. If you record it with the deed, then it is recorded with the actual deed of the property and will be seen as an encumbrance, and that will help justify your legal ability to enforce that option. And again, you want to try to hash out as much of these terms. A lot of times landowners will be hesitant to hash out or set prices ahead of time. So it really can depend on the situation, but as much as you can, trying to get it hashed out, because you don't want to have an option and then it comes time and it's really impossible for you to act on that, and you were basically counting on that property. So that's where it can be kind of important. So land contract, so you decide to move forward with purchasing the land. Either you had the option, first right of refusal, or you just found a piece of property that you really want to buy. It's important to understand what's in the land contract. So what are those terms that are in the contract? Again, are there any restrictions on the deed? What are the actual limits of the property, having it surveyed, doing all that due diligence, and making sure a lot of that is accounted for in the sale agreement, having them disclose anything, especially if you're going to be living on the property in an existing house, having them disclose necessary things or issues they've had with the property, so that you're aware and everything you're doing. And if something goes wrong with any of those things that they said, we've never had a problem with this, and it's pretty clear later down the road that you have an ability to go back to them and say, look, you said the roof never leaked, and the roof leaks clearly, and it's clearly been happening for a number of years. Or, you said this had a certain drainage and it doesn't. So it's important to think about those things. And this is one thing I really like to empower farmers to, because I know budgets are tight, to use us lawyers when really necessary. And this is definitely one of those things. Having us look over a lease and having us look over the contract is really important. You can handle a lot of the negotiation and due diligence and understanding what's going on with your property, but when it comes time to sign a legal document, this is where it can really be worth spending a couple $100s to have a lawyer help you and look at it. That'll save you potentially thousands of dollars in the long run. So just thinking a little bit about the gift of land. So if someone gives you land, or you inherit land, or someone gives you land. So let's say your parents inherited some land, and they said, we really don't have any interest in this. We want to gift this land to you to farm. Wouldn't that be great? Then you have to kind of think about the tax implications, and largely it'd be for your parents. But basically, the IRS has a system in which $15,000 of, whether it's of something of value like land or actual money. So they might gift you, also this applies if they gift you money to buy land, then $15,000 per year of that is exempt, up to a lifetime limit of $11.4 million. But each member, so basically if it's above that, then your parents would have to pay taxes on that gift. But if there are certain rules where, like, if it's a couple and they're giving it to you and your husband to buy land, then it's $30,000, because you basically you know, if they give it to, if your parents, they each basically get the $15,000 exemption. So then they can give $30,000 to you without you having them having to pay taxes on it. But it's really important, basically, if you're dealing with any gifting of land, to talk to an accountant. You know, this is one of those situations where if you're talking to a lawyer, then it doesn't, you know, that you don't always need to talk to a lawyer, but this is one of those situations where if you, you know, where I say definitely talk to a lawyer about this, then this is one of the situations where I say definitely talk to an accountant about this. So loans and mortgages. These are where basically you're getting some sort of financing with the land, and so to purchase the land. So sometimes we see in ag, we'll see landowner financed loans in addition to bank loans or FSA loans. And this is again important where you really want to have everything in writing. If you know, a bank will usually have set terms and they'll hand you a document or the FSA and you look at it. But if you're doing landowner financing, then it's really important to come together and figure out what those terms are. So when will it be paid back? How will it be paid back? What kind of installments? Is there any situation in which if you fall in hard times, payments can be deferred? And you don't see this too much anymore, but if there's any payment for paying it off early, you know, let's say you got a mortgage or landowner financing to purchase land, and then you end up getting an inheritance from a family member and you pay it off early. Is there any penalty for that? What is the interest rate? You cannot have an interest-free loan. The IRS doesn't like that because they want to make sure they're getting their cut. So basically, if you have a loan, it has to have some sort of interest rate, or otherwise the IRS implies one, and up to $15,000, they'll treat it as a gift. But if it's more than that, then you can be slapped with taxes. So it's important to understand what those interest rate rules are and what the interest rate on your property is, and weigh, you know, if you're getting an offer from landowner financing versus bank financing, which one is better for you in terms of that. And for each payment, you know, unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with student loans and even some mortgages ourselves. You know, how is the principal and interest allocated on the payments? What portion of it is going towards the principal payment on your loan, and what portion is going to interest? So it's really important to understand, you know, the financing. And again, this is something where it might be important, especially if you're doing a landowner loan finance purchase. It's really important to have lawyers involved for those kind of things, as well as talking to an accountant. And I always recommend talking to an accountant in regards to anything financial. And finally, talking about affordability. So what are some options that can help make purchasing land more affordable? And these are really options that you don't see. The purchasing at ag value, we haven't seen a ton in Pennsylvania. Purchasing land with an easement, we see a little more. Basically, these are ways that reduce the purchase price and also the potential transfer tax and taxes, you know, on the property once you own it. So if you're purchasing it at ag value, that means basically there's been an assessment as to what is the value of this land with agriculture on it and not any other development. Not basically, most fair market value of property is assessed based on its most potentially developed use or its highest grossing use. So this is a way to kind of adjust that land value based on its use as a farm. And then purchasing land with an easement, if a land has a ag easement or a conservation easement on it, that's going to reduce the value of the land because those easements are saying you can't develop this land. So obviously that's going to reduce the fair market value. So these are ways that you can either look to purchase lands with an easement or purchasing an ag value, or if you own property, especially looking at putting an easement on it, that may reduce your tax liability, because unfortunately, not only is purchasing land difficult, but keeping up with the costs of land can be very difficult, especially as land becomes more and more valuable. So now George is going to talk about land encumbrances and easements. So he's going to talk about, what are the impacts of these easements and gas leases on purchasing property as well as leasing property, and also the opportunities with them as well.
Hi, all. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about easements. An easement is a non-possessory right to use another person's land for a specific purpose. In other words, you have a legal right to go on to someone else's land without owning it. What you own instead is the right to basically share that land, to use it in a certain manner if you're the easement holder. Easements do not necessarily allow the easement holder to occupy the land, that is, to occupy it permanently, nor do you have a legal right to exclude others, including the landowner, from occupying that land. You have instead a right to prevent others. You have a right to use the land for a specific purpose and to preclude others, including the landowner, from interfering with the right that you have to use that land. So let me give you just sort of a common example, which is power companies. Power companies commonly have easements in rural areas that run across the land, and along with that easement, they have a right to trim vegetation to prevent the vegetation and trees from impacting their use of the land, which is designed to carry power across the land. In addition to actually, so their easement is designed to carry power across the land. That's the limited purpose for which they use the land, and to protect that easement, that purpose, they have a right to trim trees, right? The land that's burdened by the easement, just in terms of terminology you may run into, is called the servient estate, and the land or person who holds easement is known as the dominant estate. So how are easements created? Well, they're easily created by a legal document, right? Their easements are can be found in written documents in a number of different forms, such as a deed, a will, or even a contract between the landowner and another person or entity. There's certain legal formalities to create an easement. You have to embody the easement in a written document. There has to be signatures on the document. And the document, the easement has to be recorded, because the whole purpose of an easement is, in particular, the recording of the easement, is to give notice to others that the land is encumbered in some way. So, for example, if the landowner goes out and attempts to get a mortgage on the land, that mortgage or will be able to go to a courthouse and do a deed record search, right, a title search, and find out what encumbrances there are on that land. That also would be how you would be able to obtain information about the land that you may want to enter onto for farming. It's important to understand what encumbrances are on the land whenever you either are looking to purchase the land to establish a farm, or to get onto land to establish a farm, so that you understand what your rights are and what rights other persons hold. When you think about, and we'll talk a little bit about this in terms of oil and gas rights too, in the law, when you talk about property rights, persons often talk about this fiction of a bundle of sticks, right? And each piece of property has certain rights associated with it, and each right is embodied by this idea of a stick. And when you have all the rights associated with that land, you have the entire bundle of sticks, and there are certain rights that you can give up with respect to that land. You can sell them. For example, you could sell the right to someone else for someone else to develop minerals associated with that land. And that would be one right under which you would give up. You have the right to develop your land in some manners. In some rights, some of those rights are encumbered by either things previously done by property owners or by the government, right? Through zoning, for example. Zoning can impact what rights you have to develop your land. Generally, an easement holder has a right to do whatever is reasonably necessary in order to fully enjoy the purposes of the easement. And that includes crossing land that's not encumbered by the easement, portions of the property that are not encumbered by the easement. For example, in order to access the easement, for example, again, continuing on with the power company, let's say, has a 100-foot right-of-way crossing over a piece of land, has a couple high-tension power lines running across the land. They have the right, in addition, so they would have the right to ensure that their power lines are not interfered with by, let's say, vegetative growth for trees growing nearby. But they also, and it's long been a role in Pennsylvania property law, that easement holders have a right to cross over land to get to their easement, so that other private property to get to their easement. So they would have the right, let's say their property their power lines bisect a 200-acre parcel of land, they would have the right to cross over the rest of the acreage, and it's been held in at least one case, they have a right to build a temporary road across that land if that's reasonably necessary for them to continue to use put to use their easement. In that case, they were crossing over private property. It was a golf course, building a temporary road because they had a right under their easement to upgrade their power lines, and they wanted to upgrade their power lines from H towers to Christmas tree towers. The owner of the servient land doesn't give up all the rights just because they have an easement on their land. They only give up the rights that are defined within that easement. So they may continue to use their land in any manner that doesn't interfere with the easement holder's use of the easement. So, for example, again, with the power company, if you're a farmer and you lease your land you enter into an easement allowing the power company to run power lines across your land, you of course can continue to farm the land under those power lines, so long as your farming doesn't interfere with the easement holder's use of their rights. And so all of this goes to say that when you find out that land, whether you are the landowner, whether you're going to be purchasing land, or whether you're looking to rent land for farming, and you find out there's an easement on it, the holder, it's important to understand the rights what rights the property owner has given up through an easement and what rights the easement holder has. And all of that is driven by the description of the easement itself. It is an easement it embodies the right to use land for a specific purpose. And so the breadth of the easement is contained in that document, and you have to sort of obtain that document and read through it to understand what the easement holder's rights are with respect to that land. And they can be both positive and negative. Negative easements are less common than positive easements. However, one that you will in common that we're going to talk about next is a conservation easement. And often persons will own land. They will enter into a conservation easement with a third party, for example, Allegheny Land Trust or Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And the purpose of that easement is to conserve the land, right? Conserve soil, maybe protecting a stream, a particularly high quality stream that runs across the land. An example of a negative easement is that the person who owns the land agrees to be paid in some cases or donates their right to develop their property that they otherwise would have if they didn't have the easement on it. And the right to subdivide their property, for example, so that you have a 200-acre farm with a conservation easement, and the easement may say that the property can, there's a particular 10 acres of that 200 acres that can be subdivided, and another house can be built on it for family members, but the other remaining 190 acres cannot be subdivided. You know, that's an example of a negative easement that impacts the property owners, the rights the property owner would otherwise have. And so there's certain statutes in Pennsylvania that authorize persons to enter into conservation easements. The purpose of course, is to limit certain uses of the land in order to advance certain conservation objectives. That would be the purpose of the easement, is the conservation objectives. And typically, a conservation easement involves a written agreement between the landowner and either a third party like a private trust, which, for example, Allegheny Land Trust or West Pennsylvania Conservancy, or some other smaller land trust across Pennsylvania, or an agreement between a property owner and the government. The land trust has in Pennsylvania, once they obtain that easement, they have a legal obligation to enforce the terms of the easement. For example, a case that I was involved in, the purpose of them enforcing the easement is to stop uses of the land that are not consistent with the easement. So, for example, case I was involved in involved the land trust that owned a conservation easement on a piece of property, that, and it was a relatively large farm. The farmer sold the property to a successor. The successor then wanted to lease the gas rights for development, and in Pennsylvania, at least the mineral state is separate from the surface estate, and so by seeking to lease the mineral rights, the property owner was effectively subdividing the land, similar to if you would put a line across the land and sell 100 acres off for construction of a home. It so happened that the conservation easement in that case prohibited the land from being subdivided, except for a small piece of the surface estate on which multiple houses could be built for the family members. And that case went to court, and Superior Court actually ruled in favor of the land trust to prevent the successor purchaser from subdividing the land and leasing the mineral rights. So the easement, as illustrated, continues in effect even if the property is transferred, unless bought out or otherwise revoked. So the question is then, you are interested in perhaps starting a farm either by renting on someone else's land or by using some of your own land. And the question then, a number of questions that you have to ask if you find out that they're, about a conservation easement on the land. How will the easement, for example, so an easement could be beneficial, right? If you're a landowner, you could use an easement to protect the land in perpetuity, so that it is no longer, so that it is not developed in the future, and that it remains a farm or uses consistent with a farm. You can use, if you're able to interest a third party in conserving the land, you may be able to actually earn some money off of transferring the conservation, encumbering the land with the conservation easement. You can also, but it also imposes, of course, restrictions that you need to be aware of. So you have to ask yourself, how will the easement limit the future transfer of the property and its value? It will no doubt have some impact on future value of the property. And you have, before entering into an easement, you need to assure yourself that those are restrictions that you, as the property owner, are willing to live with. Ask yourself what the objectives of the easement are, and how does any of your own activities or future activities that you may plan comply with the easement? Are there any restrictive covenants in the easement that may impact you, what activities you have planned for the property? For example, ag entertainment type of activities. Is there an easement on the property that involves, for example, conservation? And are those activities that you plan on engaging in, for example, ag entertainment, consistent with the terms of the conservation easement? The state conservation program, so what we've mostly been talking about thus far is, a landowners entering into a conservation easement with a private party, mostly a land trust, who are authorized by state law to hold those types of easement. But there are other conservation easements in Pennsylvania, and they're actually held by the government. The state has a conservation program. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. I have some of the bullets up on the screen, but there are limits on how you enroll, how a property owner enrolls land in this conservation program. It is a voluntary program. It's implemented by county governments. It's funded by the state. There's a lot more land that persons want to put in this program that than there is funding to purchase those easements. So typically there's a waiting list, and you have to meet the land has to meet certain qualifications. So the farm has to typically be located in an ag security area, has to be comprised of 500 acres of viable agricultural land, the security area. The property itself has to be at least 5 acres in size. There are certain circumstances and exceptions within the law for smaller parcels of land to be enrolled. And at least 50% of the property has to either be harvested cropland, pasture, or grazing land, and the soils have to meet a certain classification. And then the farm has to go through an assessment and appraisal process prior to the county's purchase of the easement. There are differences between the state program and the private land trust that you would want to be aware of, both in terms of either someone coming in to rent land or as a property owner or prospective purchaser. Typically, land trusts are a lot more flexible in how the conservation easement can be tailored. So you can write an easement, a private conservation easement, to allow largely whatever you agree to with the third party, right? If you are wanting to conserve only a piece of the land that has riparian buffer for a stream that has particular value, it can be a very narrowly constructed easement that encumbers the land in very basic terms. The state program, is not as flexible. So they are looking specifically to purchase easements that preserve land for agricultural purposes. The good thing about the state program is it'll pay market value for the easement. Land trusts, generally do not. You may run into certain circumstances, and we have that, where a land trust is looking to purchase specific property because it has particular value and they have funding that they can transfer to the property owner to purchase that easement, but that's not always the case. Often they are looking for land conservation easements to be donated, and then the landowner in turn obtains certain tax benefits from the donation of that conservation easement. As I said, the state program typically has a backlog, and so it can take months, if not years, to get into to enroll land in that program. Private land trusts can often negotiate a conservation easement and do their due diligence on the property, within months. And again, as I said, the purpose of the conservation easement in a private context can be tailored to meet your needs and that of the land trust needs, whereas the state program is designed specifically to protect agricultural lands. And the state program has other limits that may or may not be a part of the private easement. They, for example, only allow land use that's consistent with ag production, and the state program only allows construction of only one additional residence. And windmills, which you would think are consistent with agricultural land, are not allowed because of legislation under the state program. The state program also requires use of a conservation plan by the farm that is on the farmers that are using that land. So there are a number of differences between the two approaches. If you're a landowner and interested in entering into a conservation easement, you want to explore all your alternatives. Think through the future uses of the land, the impact of having an easement on the land, the benefits of having that easement, and then choose the program that's right for you. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about energy development and how it interacts. I already mentioned one example of how conservation easements affect energy development. If you're entering into or purchasing land that already has a mineral lease associated with that land, and you're interested in a conservation easement, then you're going to need to look at your various alternatives for the easement and for conserving the land as an agricultural space. The state program specifically allows oil and gas development, but not surface mining on the land. Whereas often private land trusts want to ensure that there is no, at least on-site, gas development. So while the state conservation program specifically provides for oil and gas development and does not preclude a shale gas well pad, for example, from being located on the land, that's not something that you would likely find land trusts being willing to do, though because they have flexibility, they may be willing to allow mineral development to occur beneath the land so long as there's not surface structures put on top of the land. In the case of so the information on this slide, I guess I already covered, and I had an example on the slide with the subdivision prohibition in an easement that precluded mineral development. Historically, for land to be enrolled in the state program, the right to surface mine could not be resolved. I mentioned that already. And that there's express authorization for extraction of oil and gas on land. I think the main message to take home from at least this segment of the discussion is simply that, that bundle of sticks idea, it's important to either as a renter or a landowner or a prospective landowner who's looking to entertain getting into farming, it's important to understand who has all of this, who has the rights to all the sticks that form the bundle associated with that bundle of rights associated with that land. Has the mineral, or the mineral already leased out? And if so, what are the terms of that lease? Is there an easement on the property? If not, what options do you have? How many options do you have with respect to those bundles moving forward? And sit down and develop a plan for yourself on how you want to proceed, how best it is for you to proceed for not only your activities, but those of future generations, your children, or in looking out a year, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years into the future in terms of developing your farm and what options you want to retain with respect to the land, and how you're going to work that out and maneuver through in some instances where other persons already own certain rights to your land, for example, if their mineral rights are already leased out. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, so questions. If you guys have questions, Dan, I guess now you can ask.
Yeah. Yeah, folks, if you do have any questions, you can use the chat box on the bottom of your screen. You can just open that up and type your message where it says type message here. And so we'll hold for a moment to see if any questions come through. I will say, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, the resource that was referenced is called the Farmland, Leasing, and Purchasing Arrangements. And that is a chart, several page document on the PASA website. If you go to pasafarming.org to our resources page, it's a few items down, and that has a list of various land access strategies ranging everything from farm incubators and handshake deals, as were referenced earlier, all the way through the various types of different leasing considerations and arrangements, all the way to outright purchase, as well as then some definitions and some live links on the website to other organizations and other work that might be relevant. Still not seeing any questions coming through here, so I will put another plug in. There is the resource, USDA resource session tomorrow afternoon at the Kingsley Association in Pittsburgh. So if you are looking to access USDA programs and resources, that's an opportunity. And the Farmland potluck and discussion that was mentioned is a week from today, Monday, October 14th, from 5 to 8 in Mercer, PA. And so that'll be a tour of that facility, a discussion about Western Pennsylvania Conservancy's land access program, and then a discussion with the National Young Farmers Coalition about farmland access in general. So I see a question here. What are some platforms people use to find farmland?
Dan, I feel like you could talk to that more so than we can, but I mean, I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is, not unfortunately, but through kind of relationships and groups. So, through organizations like PASA, through the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and through also kind of local land organizations, in the sense that it's a lot of who you know, and somebody knows someone who's trying to lease out their land or sell it, and then making those connections within there to do that, and through a lot of these ag organizations that are trying to aggregate people and this type of information. But Dan, maybe you can talk more to some of the ways PASA helps with that, or if you're aware of other ways too.
Yeah, so the one organization that's tasked with that specifically is Pennsylvania FarmLink, and they have a portal for both putting in a profile of yourself as a person seeking land, and for farms and farmland to be offered. Unfortunately, that portal is way overbalanced in favor of people who are seeking land, and there's not enough opportunities to come close to filling the demand. So kind of to what Marlene was saying, really putting it out there to your network, and then connecting with other folks via organizations like PASA, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, whoever your local farm bureau, and even just farmers in the fields. If you're out there at a market, or if you're running into farmers in your life, to let folks know that you're looking for land, where you're looking for it, and what kind of criteria you're looking to fulfill. Is really the way that a lot of land is transferring. There's a lot of farms that are never offered for sale. It's just that somebody, a family can't take care of the land, is looking to unload the land, and they find somebody who they know of and offer it to them in a sort of one-to-one arrangement. So it is really worth putting it out there into the world and letting folks know that you're looking. And then just to be really clear about what you're looking for, don't jump on the first thing that becomes available necessarily. If it's good and it fits your needs, go for it. But if it doesn't, you should be. It is a huge investment, so it is worth being a little bit choosy. And then, yeah, the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy's Farmland Access Program, which is a new thing that's coming online, is a program where they are purchasing and then leasing out farms to folks who are looking to get started in farming at a reasonable rate with the sort of backstop and support of an organization like WPC. And then we are, PASA and other organizations help to advise them on how best to administer that land. So that's a long way of saying that it's a lot of little hammers to be sort of working on all fronts to find farmland. Give everyone a moment for just any other questions that might come up. One thing to that last point about identifying land that meets your needs, this is linked below the document on the PASA website, or you can find it directly through a web search. But the Penn State Extension has a farmland assessment checklist that can be really helpful for thinking through all of the various nuts and bolts of considerations for what you need or want from your farmland. And then that's when, as you start to find places, then you can start engaging with various legality and arrangements that we talked about here today. Okay, well, I'm going to say that I guess that's it as far as questions coming in. I want to thank our presenters today, Marlene and George. And for any of you who are interested in accessing this, we will be posting it and making it available to you next couple of days. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Dan.